Thanks very much, Bernard, and thanks commenting on my Dutch accent. This is the best you'll get after the bar opens. It gets a lot worse, so I'm glad you can understand me now. We're going to talk a bit about geopolitics, and I think I want to take you back first a bit to almost a strategy that China was very early on looking at electric mobility. Do you know when they, for the first time, mentioned we need to start looking at electric mobility? It was in their 5-year plan for 1991. Elon Musk was still chasing girls at college. Since then, they've been very strategically building out their capabilities in that space, including in the 2000s buying up lots of family companies in Germany that were simply good at one thing: quality assurance, making parts to German standards for the German car industry, and using that insight to actually start building a formidable car industry in China. Resulting now that they have some companies that not only build cars, but they have the construction companies that build their gigafactories, that build the batteries for their cars, and their own the ships that ship those cars around the world. Very difficult to compete with if you've taken such a long-term strategic view at this sector. Still, what chased critical materials debate to the forefront as well? Over the last few years, we've had 100 critical mineral policies launched around the world. We've had COVID. We had a logistics disruption, everybody waking up. This is a very globally connected world that we're talking about. We had the chip crisis, stopping car industries around the world. We had Germany finding out that, 40% of our gas and energy use is coming from Russia, who went to war to the Ukraine. And we've had decades of deindustrialization in Europe, in the US. And as a result, when you want to build and relook at critical materials, you find out you're missing a lot of parts of the chain to actually make that a sensible policy. With me on the stage, we've got Tim Gould, who's Chief Economist at International Energy Agency. We have Paul Gait, who's Group Head of Strategy at Anglo American, and Jeff Townsend, who's the founder of the Critical Minerals Association. We already had a few numbers mentioned on the importance of Africa in a minerals debate, and maybe let's start with that, Tim. The International Energy Agency, beyond forecasting energy demand, has also started doing a lot of good work in the critical minerals policy and establishing the needs based on different policy scenarios and emission scenarios that we're heading for up till 2050. What amount of commodities we need for what technology. Maybe you can highlight a couple of things from that report so we get a bit of context how important Africa is and also which are the important commodities, again, that we're talking about.
Thanks very much indeed, Henk, and it's a great pleasure and a slightly unfamiliar pleasure to join a conference like this, and it speaks to the evolution in the way that the IEA is looking at these issues. We're an intergovernmental organisation advising governments on energy policy, but as you rightly point out, the sort of energy security risks that governments are paying attention to are very different now than perhaps they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think particularly after the global energy crisis, the turbulence that we've seen and the awareness among governments that high reliance on a single source, in the case of Russian gas for Europe, created vulnerabilities which people had been sort of semi-blind to, or at least some countries had been semi-blind to for some time. People are now hyper-aware of potential risks and vulnerabilities as we move into a new kind of energy system. And we are moving into that new energy system relatively fast, at least in some parts of the world. So over the last 5 years, we've seen the amount of money going each year into clean energy technologies go up from slightly above 1 trillion each year to something like 2 trillion this year. That is also very concentrated. So 85% of that clean energy investment is coming from advanced economies and coming from China. But that, of course, creates strong demand for the inputs to those manufacturing processes. And we have seen very strong increases, particularly for lithium, but pretty much across the board. So that now the energy sector is very prominent in all areas of critical mineral demand. So if back in sort of mid part of the last decade, only around 50% of the demand for lithium-ion batteries came from the energy sector. Now we're well above 90%, and that's going to be, that's pretty much where we're going to be from now on. And I think everyone's aware that there is a high degree of market concentration in all parts of critical mineral value chains, as indeed there is in clean energy manufacturing more widely. And there is a strong push from policymakers to increase the resilience and diversity of those chains. And that's where Africa comes into the picture. There is, of course, existing, strong value chains out of Africa for those commodities. The areas that have traditionally been, front and center: cobalt, copper, manganese, platinum. There is a lot more that could. Graphite's very interesting at the moment. There's big discussions around that. I think the other area that we need to be very conscious of is that if energy transitions are to be a success, then Africa has to be also a big demand center. We have 60% of the world's solar resource, or the best solar resources in Africa, but only 1% of the installed capacity for solar PV. If we look at the numbers for last year, sort of 85% of clean energy manufacturing investment happened in 85% last year, or 2022 in China. That's down to about 75% because Europe is stepping up, the US is stepping up, but hardly anything of that takes place in Africa. So I think we need to be looking at sort of the near-term story being around sort of that traditional provider of resources and potentially refined products to other parts of the world. But for us, the prize has to be the value of that market in of itself for the longer term.
Excellent, thanks, Tim. Paul, Anglo-American has been in Africa for over 100 years and has successfully mined there for most of that time. But you're facing different type of competition nowadays. There's a lot more Chinese parties obviously active. You've got Russia there now. You've also got cash-rich Middle East investors based on the recent investment in Zambia. You've got quite a lot more competition, but some of the competition also has different capital and investment returns and timeframes. Can you still compete as a Western company in Africa on that basis?
Look, I think the answer to that sort of has got to be yes. And I think that, of course, the sort of first point is that the deposits that we seek to sort of mine, the deposits, the assets that we look to, exploit, they belong fundamentally, of course, to the host country. But then when it comes to sort of working out how to develop those assets, I think that there's more than just sort of capital, at work here, right? We've got to sort of look at sort of, a holistic solution. And I think, if you look at, for an example, an industry like copper, it's not arguably for want of capex that the assets aren't being developed, right? If we look at sort of the copper price today, look at where I think the copper price will go, that's probably still in and of itself not going to be the only factor that actually unlocks those mines. If you look at something like Pebble, that has been, sterilized not sterilized, however we want to sort of put it, but that's not been developed, but not because the economics don't stack up, but because there are a host of other factors at work. There's a whole host of sort of community, sustainability, social, also technical sort of factors that come to bear in the development of any of these sort of assets, not just essentially the ability to provide capital. So I think that's the sort of first point. And when we look at our ability to compete for assets, we would try and look at it as a collective across all of those factors and what it is that we bring to bear on multiple, on multiple dimensions, and how it is that can create a sustainable solution over the longer term, right? So it's not just about sort of, writing a large check on day one and saying, well, that's job done. And I don't think, of course, I don't think many people would sort of look at it in that way either, right? You have to be able to provide something that is, that is of longer term benefit to both the investors, the local communities, the host governments, and so on, and so forth. And that's why Anglo has had a strategy for a very long time of emphasizing the sort of social and the sustainable sort of credentials, of the group. And if we look at a project like Quellaveco that we sort of recently, it was on one of the gentleman's slides, from earlier, if we look at a project like Quellaveco that we sort of developed, it was those sustainability, that social sort of aspect that was sort of critical in being able to deliver the project on time, on budget, despite sort of going through sort of COVID, at the same time. But, the other sort of point, however, is that, I'm sort of, when you mention that sort of, with a different sort of, outlook in terms of capital, a different sort of time frame and so on and so forth, that sort of remind, that conversation from the beginning this morning when John was sort of talking about, why is it, what does he see, in terms of the competition, particularly, for example, from Chinese companies? I mean, how did he put it? They're hungrier, they have a greater tolerance for failure, and they act more quickly, right? In other words, they are prepared to compete harder than we are. And I think one of the problems that we've seen in the sort of mining industry collectively is we've kind of lost that sort of animal spirit or that hunger to actually go out and compete for these assets. Now, is this a sort of, a sort of competency point? Well, that's partly, but it's also related to how we finance, how we look at these, how, our tolerance for risk, right? You see it when you look at sort of the internal rates of return that you require from some of these investments, and it's layer upon layer upon layer, right, of risk discounting. Then you apply a 1.5 times multiple to your capex estimate. Then you take consensus price forecasts, and then you wonder why you can't do anything. Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. What you've done is you've chosen not to compete, right? We need to strip away that in order to enable us, not to sort of rely on government protection, not to rely on sort of policy. I'm again, as was so eloquently put, a believer in free markets, the competition and the creative power, of those free markets. But what we've got to get back to is a position where Western mining companies actually compete again.
Fair point. The problem is often...
I think we should give him a slot to be the opening speaker next time. Tim, every time you come, you're more worked up. I like that.
No, fair point. Free markets, way to go. It's just, Jeff, if I look at some expectations of African governments, they say, look, we've got lots of lithium in the ground here, but we want you to mine it, concentrate it, put battery material together and put a giga plant down, please. How do you deal with government policy? You advise and you're sitting on a lot of these government groups. How do governments respond to help their industry or their sourcing strategies if those are the demands that are put on the table? Because you would like to have those factories built in Hull, for example.
Yeah, usually badly is how they respond. So I think the first starting point is it is absolutely the goal of the host nation to get the best deal for its people, right? Mine is not the government's, it is the people's, right? And that's the starting point. So let's get the best deal for the people, and that goes down into a social license to operate and the ability to bring the local community in and engage and part of the project, not necessarily just a beneficiary of the project. How does the West engage and change that? I think it gets down to 3 key points. So the first is to actually have progressive conversation and have an honest conversation. There are nations around the world where it does not make sense to build the second half of the midstream in that nation, simply because of where that is going to end up, right? You're not going to put a CAM plant, maybe I'm wrong, but it would probably make little sense to put a CAM plant in parts of Australia when you can put it somewhere else where there's a bigger downstream automotive exit, right? So where do you naturally align that midstream? And I think that really has to get to a point. The UK has a brilliant chemical industry. So here in the UK, it makes a lot of sense to place further specialization in that midstream here. But it makes a lot more sense to do as much of that midstream processing in country as possible. And that doesn't necessarily fit into the narrative of the UK government at the moment. The second thing I would say is governments, Western governments in particular, I don't believe there is a free market at the moment. So I think it is what it is. And I think Western governments have to be better at supporting key strategic projects in engaging and getting their point across. Because as a collective part of a bigger strategy, you have more bargaining power. And that has been lacking. the UK government's got strategies with a number of countries around the world on critical minerals. How many times have you actually seen them exercising and acting on those? Very few. So I think governments have got to be better and more proactive. You said it was hunger to compete. Yeah, I completely agree. But if the rules are not in place to allow you to compete, then how do you compete? So I think that has got to be part of it. And finally, that comes down then to a global positioning. So you know, the West has created the Material Security Partnership. US, Canada, Australia, UK, most of the EU, and now India. Not one African country as part of the MSP. So you've got 52% of the global GDP, but you don't have a single country from the continent that's going to provide 30% of the world's critical minerals. If you don't give someone a voice, they're not going to listen. It's that simple.
Fair point. And Paul, maybe coming back to you on that geopolitics and alignment, you've got a UK head office, you've got operations around the world, but you kind of need a Department of Foreign Affairs as a company nowadays to pick your partner to enter into Africa, probably.
That's a very good question. I mean, and look, certainly one that we're scratching our heads on, which is for a long time. I think we've all sort of been in the sort of modality of sort of increased globalization, the Fukuyama, the sort of end of history kind of view, world view, and increasingly that looks like it's coming under pressure. And what does that then imply for how we operate, how we behave? So I think the sort of thinking that through. I mean, the first point I would sort of emphasize is that, of course, this has to be, or at least I hope it will be, collaborative. A beggar thy neighbor sort of solution, sort of adversarial approaches to the development of these resources is simply going to lead to lower growth. It's going to lead to a sterilization of these deposits, and fundamentally that will lead, in the fullness of time, to a significant downward sort of pressure, a significant downward force on economic growth. And I mean, we were talking this morning, again, John sort of made these sort of, points, 2 billion people being added to the global population, 2 billion people who have the same expectations of a higher standard of living, have the same expectation that their children will benefit from a better future than they enjoyed, and so on and so forth. But actually, let's do the math on those numbers, right? 2 billion people, what does it take to create wealth? It takes raw materials. It takes 250 kilograms of copper to create the kind of standard of living we have in the world, in the Western world today. That's before we add on the 7 million tons incremental that we saw from the electric vehicles, from green energy, and so on and so forth. 250 kilograms per person, 2 billion people. What is that? That's 500 million tons of copper, right? That's 25 years, roughly, of the output of the entire industry today to deliver that solution. So the pressure, right, the expectation, the need is absolutely categorical. And we're not going to do this, right, if we start sort of seeing enemies everywhere we turn around. So we're going to need partnerships, we're going to need collaboration, and we are going to need, cooperation in terms of the development of these assets. So of course, we don't want to sort of, I think where we could go very wrong is to divide the world into a good list and a naughty list, right? And say that, we from the position of London can categorically judge who is on, which list at any sort of given point in time, right? I think we have to, sort of move beyond that, move beyond that. So look, that is increasingly important. We are looking to partner increasingly with whomever, with the Middle East, with China, with other players in the industry. And I think as the capital intensity of mining projects rise, it's going to have to be that way, because the risk of an individual project is just getting larger and larger and larger. I mean, you take a 300,000 ton, for example, let's take a 300,000 ton copper project, right? 20 years ago, that would cost you about $1 billion, right? Now it's $7.5, 8, 9, $10 billion, and that capital intensity is only going to increase. So relative to the size of the industry, the kind of bets that we're making, right, as a proportion of the market cap is rising all the time. So that kind of process, that just of itself, that's just a sort of market dynamic, would suggest that we therefore have to enter into those kind of, perhaps joint ventures, collaborations, partnerships, enabled to de-risk, share that risk, right, across multiple players. And that, again, requires collaboration. It doesn't require a sense of them and us.
Great points there, Paul. And Tim, having studied the distribution, the build-up, the needs on the critical mineral side. If you look back in time, have you seen countries that have been particularly good at monetizing, and particularly monetizing beyond just getting the mining industry going? Can you maybe talk us through a handful of examples that you say, okay, that's the right approach that was taken, and they've been successfully monetizing their resources?
But I mean, just before that, just picking up on something that Paul was saying, certainly, I mean, the sorts of things that he's mentioning now very much coincide with the numbers that we produce. So when we look at all the projects that are underway, the ones that have been approved or at advanced stages of development, and we look at and we compare the output there with what we would need in a world that sort of hits national climate goals, sort of where you have a net zero target, you make progress towards it. Copper's the area where we see the single biggest shortfall, and lithium's the other one where we don't yet manage to make the numbers add up. Others are more balanced. So when we look at other battery metals and graphite and rare earths, but there we have probably greater issues with market concentration. But on your question, I mean, it's a little bit similar to the way that we would look at projects in the energy sector as well. I mean, the ingredients for success are sometimes, common across different extractive projects. Clearly, you're going to be looking for the capacity within country. I mean, the skills, the knowledge base, the infrastructure, the ability to process permits, and all of that kind of thing. The geological surveys, all of those kinds of things are extremely important. There's always a conversation about the quality of governance and the quality of institutions, and I guess sort of Botswana is a poster child there for some of the things that can be done. And then, again, the points that have been mentioned previously about that finding that balance, finding that fair distribution of economic rents, having a visible, transparent way in which the benefits are felt by communities, by, in terms of provision of healthcare, education, and everything else. That all seems to be very important for success. But when you're talking about moving into related areas, I think obviously market size or proximity to markets or having, that is going to be a big factor. You see that with Morocco's proximity to Europe obviously helps with the phosphates. One of the issues that you encounter then when you look at Africa is that individual markets are relatively small. It is difficult to move stuff across borders. So, were a project like the African Free Trade Area to move, that would help obviously to then create incentives for some of the investment catering to larger areas within the continent.
Jeff, if you look at the wallets that different countries have around the world to stimulate industries, there was this week in the newspapers estimated money thrown at the EV industry by China was $231 billion over the last 15 years or so. IRA is also generous, over $300 billion. Now there's a sickly balance sheet in the UK. Have you lost before you've even started?
Yeah, Saudi is something like $1 trillion, isn't it, for its industrial strategy by 2030? So everyone's playing catch up. Yeah, it's very hard to deliver a government critical mineral strategy if there's no money behind it, and that's a reality. And a lot of the smaller players in the space will get hurt by that. However, as both Tim and Paul have said, it's about collaboration. And so if you can find collaboration at a global level, actually you not necessarily need the money to do so. If we could find, instead of having 700 different ESG data points that we have to match, if we could find a collaborative one, and right, these are the 3 or 4 we think work, or 5 or 6, but right, that's going to help. That's going to level the playing field. That's going to make it easier. That's going to be more transparent. So yes, we do need a lot more money to deliver this. State intervention is the norm in a lot of ways, but there are other ways that you can operate to make this a more level playing field, which will give British companies and other companies a better chance.
Okay. Let's see where we get to. Paul, you enter Africa, there's no railway line, no power station, you have no skills on the ground, and there you are, you've got the money, the skills, the deposit is there. Who do you call on for help? Do you think mining companies can carry those investments? Is it the reason why some of the money is going somewhere else? How can Africa help, or how can you get going in Africa? What government help would you need on the infrastructural challenges?
Well, look, I mean, that's a very interesting word. I mean, but maybe just actually just sort of touching, I mean, look, CapEx obviously, capital obviously helps, right? But, I was looking this morning, NVIDIA's market cap, right? Well, what is it now, 2.7 trillion or something, right? I mean, there's more than enough capital, right? But it's just that we've chosen to allocate it to things that are peripheral to actually maintaining and, the critical factors in our standard of living. We've chosen to allocate, at least in the West, we have chosen to allocate trillions of dollars to the entertainment industry. That is our revealed preference. We didn't have to do that. We could have done something else. A fraction of that money allocated to industrial goods, right, would have accelerated, would have created real growth, as opposed to essentially the mirage of growth, actually a solution for declining standard of living, as opposed to a palliative for poverty, which is what we're really being offered, right? And so there is money, right? There is capital. It's just that as a civil society, and again, it gets back to the sort of comments that were made at the beginning of this talk, right, about the understanding of the industry, the role that it plays and its importance, right? We had sort of first quantum mines get expropriated, and Leonardo DiCaprio was busy tweeting on, wasn't this a great thing, right? Would have been better served if Leonardo DiCaprio had sort of pointed out how many electric vehicles weren't going to get made as a consequence of that expropriation, right? How many people weren't going to get lifted out of poverty as a consequence of that delay in the supply of that raw material. And when he starts to get onto the bandwagon of actually being a proponent as opposed to a hindrance to this industry, then hopefully we'll see a different cost of capital, the ability of not just government, but of private capital, of fund managers, of financial institutions to provide the funding that we need. So, look, when it comes to the things that we'd like, of course, we would like, the normal wish list, right? We would like, a process. I think one of the first things we would like is a sort of permitting process that can sort of act quickly, right? The way we can have a sort of dialogue that enables these things to move to move rapidly. Visibility and transparency on the sort of fiscal policy that's required. And again, it's not that we're just saying, look, we don't, low tax, high. What we just want is just, constant, right? Just being stable is what we're really sort of, aiming for. The ability to, simply enable us to sort of get in and, develop those assets in the manner in which we would like. I mean, what am I actually sort of saying? In many ways, it's actually almost that you kind of want government to step aside and let capital markets, let private enterprise come in and develop these deposits. And if you can do that, that's essentially what created the growth that we saw in the early years of the mining industry in the US, for example, is what we've seen, in certain parts of Africa. And that's, I think, one of the greatest facilitators of
I guess, though, if you look at boom periods, governments do exactly the opposite thing. It happened in Panama for different reasons. It happened in Mexico, where they nationalized the lithium industry.
Yep.
Codelco stepping into the lithium industry. And it seems they're getting it wrong from a timing perspective all the time, because what it does tend to delay the development of those industries.
100%. I mean, and if you look, I mean, you can see the history of, what happened to the Chilean copper output, post the nationalization of its mines. You can see what happened in Zambia when they had the nationalization. What happened to Zambian output when that occurred, right? Political risk is just a death knell for investment in the mining industry, because these are capital-intensive, long lead time, long payback projects. So therefore, what you need is stability over that horizon. I can't think of a sort of single example where that kind of action hasn't done anything other than other than rob that country of a benefit that they could have otherwise reaped. But of course, at the same time, there has to be a sort of quid pro quo. You can't have investment structures that basically are put in place that are designed essentially to ensure that you never pay any tax in the country in question, right? So, it looks very, it all looks very smart in an analyst's report in London or New York when it's being written that says essentially company X is actually, when you look at it, its effective tax rate is 0 for the next 35 years. well, that's just a recipe for disaster as well, right? There has to be an even and a fair distribution, of the output from these, deposits. But if it can be done so in a manner that is transparent and stable, that's what facilitates investment.
Bit of a left fielder for you, Tim. Africa is starting to find lots of oil. We've had the Angola, obviously. We had the Namibian finds. South Africa has in principle potential. Ghana, Uganda. There's some phenomenal oil fields that have been coming to the fore. How does one handle that when everybody is telling them, no, put green energy in and go electrical vehicles? Are we going to stop that development, or is it's coming naturally, now it's our turn?
I think you'd have to have a conversation about the way that we see market balances. So we just released a new oil market outlook to 2030. This year, global oil demand is probably going to grow by around 1 million barrels a day. I mean, that's an IEA number. OPEC number is considerably higher, but the consensus is around one and a bit. In our view, we're going to see reduced growth in the future years, such that by the end of this decade, we get to around 106 million barrels a day, including biofuels of demand, and that'll, in our view, probably be close to where a high point is reached for global oil demand. On the supply side, we already have 6 million barrels a day of spare capacity, and there's lots of growth coming from non-OPEC plus countries, Guyana, Brazil, from the US still. So we potentially will have 106 million barrels a day of demand and something like 114 million barrels a day of oil production capacity. Now that is a market risk. I mean, it puts a lot of pressure on the strategies of the big resource holders. But it also should raise questions on the investment strategies then of companies looking to get into that market and imagining that there is going to be a very attractive price for a long time, especially if countries take their climate commitment seriously and we see accelerated deployment of some of the clean technologies that would meet demand for mobility in other ways. So I guess, we're not, I don't think anyone is in a position to dictate to countries how they view resource developments, but I think we can have a very productive conversation about market risk, commercial risk, environmental risks associated with different choices.
Okay, excellent. Are there any questions from the audience, Bernard?
The audience is fast asleep.
It's after lunch.
But that's never stopped me making up questions and claim it comes from Anonymous. So let's just go to a question or two, and then you can continue as well. I mean, when Paul was really on a roll there, I thought at some stage he's going to suggest that we get Taylor Swift to use her social media presence to speak on behalf of the mining industry. We need help.
Which is for diamonds, of course.
For diamonds, of course, yeah, for diamonds. Paul, let me see if this is a question. Sorry, sometimes these things come through as statements. Arguably that. So either the person doesn't speak English, like Henk and I, or the typist typed it incorrectly, or the typer. It arguably is, no, sorry. Let me rephrase this. I need to read it. You guys don't know what I go through yet to try and make sense of some of these questions, hey? So this question or comment is about Paul's naughty and nice geopolitical list has already been established by global regulators. Is that right? And if so, how do we correct this? So is this like a permanent categorization, and how do we address that?
Look, I don't think it will be a sort of permanent sort of categorization, or at least I hope not, right? I mean, if the direction of travel is greater sort of alienation, sort of greater othering of the sort of, people with which we disagree. Now, of course, there are certain sort of actors that we would just never, that we wouldn't sort of partner with sort of categorically. But that's a very small sort of subset, of the, of the countries, that we're talking about. What I'm sure of is that if the direction of travel is further, further fragmentation, further disintegration, right, then that it will have an impact on our ability to develop resources. That will have an impact on growth. And beggar thy neighbor solutions, right, time and time again, right, aren't the way for growth. They're not the way for economic development, and they benefit no one in the long run. So I'm sure that, in the fullness of time, our political leaderships will sort of recognize that fact, and that we will sort of move towards, greater, dialogue, greater cooperation, and so on and so forth. I think that has to be the base case.
A question from Mr. or Miss Anonymous again. And Tim, if you're comfortable to answer this, just to start the conversation, would Saudi Arabia be richer today if it had not nationalized its oil fields and created Saudi Aramco? But you can also have a Norwegian conversation. I mean, so natural resources, nationalization, not nationalization. Is there one answer? What's the correct answer?
I don't think I'd go to this specific example, but I think I mean, Aramco is a very well-run company. They manage their resources well. I mean, when we look at one of the things that we can do when we look at different countries and the way they manage their industry is also look now at satellite data. Because you can see methane leaks, you can see indications of well-managed upstream versus others. And I mean, when you look at the satellite readings across Saudi, it is a well-run oil industry. And indeed, when they look at the way that some other countries have managed resource development in a slightly more market-driven, but should we say more chaotic and lots of animal spirits involved, they find that also sometimes unsettling, because that comes with a cost. It comes with a cost of efficiency. It comes with a cost of environmental waste as well in many cases.
Thank you. Jeff, are you happy to take the next question from the same anonymous person?
Depends what it is.
This person is very busy, eh? Where does uranium sit with respect to energy security and geopolitics? Anybody wants to talk about uranium?
Well, I think starting point is nuclear has got to play a significant role if we're going to meet 2050 goals, right? So globally, that's imperative, and that goes down to collaboration. We need all the critical mineral projects to work if we're going to meet 2050. So it's got to be part of it. Is there a geopolitical risk? Of course. I would argue that critical minerals at a political level at a global level, it is as geopolitical as it is economic at the moment. And that is something that we need to find an answer to. Yeah.
So the people are waking up, and I'm having great fun saying you're too late, you can stop typing now. Henk, I want to ask you, I always watch with amazement these announcements of sourcing and origins, and Russia's palladium is not going to come to the world anymore. But it does. So how much of this is just total bullshit and political posturing, and how much is this real? From your perspective, and let's talk platinum, PGMs, the area you understand extremely well.
Other commodities as well. You shouldn't forget that everywhere you're trying to plug a hole, there's something else that pops open, and Russia is no different. A lot of the metal has started to flow into China. Very difficult to control. It's a bit more difficult if you have material that goes in pipelines, because they take quite a while to build and construct, and
they can be
that's where
up,
Russia misjudged things a bit. They shut the pipe on the European side, and the Chinese are now holding them basically to ransom, saying, look, we want your gas in principle, but this is the price we're going to pay. So I think where you can still disrupt those type of things is insurance on ships, for example, is normally getting disrupted. Financing of the payment systems, and there's a bit of a barter system that's now happening on some of the Chinese and Russian transactions as well. So it's not easy to stop flow of materials by having a certain part of the world saying we don't want your material anymore. It does flow in another direction, and that's very clear. You can see it in all the trade statistics as well. South Africa has partly suffered because you can see the volumes of PGMs exported to China have properly collapsed, and other markets will have to be found for that. So it's not easy to block a country altogether.
Paul, the question I'm not going to put to you, so relax. Paul, with recent announcements, is Anglo still going to focus on Africa or become a South American company? But the question I really want to ask you, this is a real question, but we're
Yeah.
not going to talk about the elephants, the big elephants, and all the
I
egos.
can't think of any either. So.
So the question I do want to ask you is a theoretical question. Where's that question now? Does consolidation help or hinder the growth of the mining sector? Clearly, consolidation is fantastic.
Great hindrance to the development of natural resources, clearly. It's a loaded question, if ever there was
of course,
one.
we can cut head offices and
Look, I mean,
combine
I think it can sort of cut both ways, right? I mean, on one hand, you can sort of legitimately say that it increases, the sort of, the scale, the competence, and so on and so forth that you can bring to bear. On the other hand, of course, then there is the temptation inevitably to sort of act as a monopolist, right? Where, it's better to take sort of the rents on, on existing supply than it is to sort of develop future supply, right? So I think that, a sort of case can be sort of made, made either way. I mean, I think in the sort of, the sort of elephant in the room in the case was, let's say, Anglo and BHP. I think, clearly the view that, we as a, company have is that the world is a sort of better place for having Anglo-American as another voice in it, as another factor, as another producer, as a company that tries to approach things in a different way, right? We thought that these issues around sustainability, around the social sort of license to operate and so on and so forth, partly because of, where we came from sort of in Africa, in South Africa, where we had to engage with these issues, I think a lot earlier than others in the industry did, because they were very incident. I'm thinking here about things to do with, for example, the ART therapy that we rolled out, in South Africa, because, it was incident on our business, and we were forced to address these kind of questions. And that then creates a sort of culture and a sort of, view about how the mining industry sort of behaves. So, look, from an economic perspective, you can argue both sides of it. From the sort of, in the sort of particular instance that we're sort of referring to, I think having Anglo as another voice, having Anglo as another independent producer able to create and hopefully operate in a slightly different way has moved the industry forward and has moved that debate forward and, to the betterment, I think, collectively. But then again, I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yeah, no, of course. No, of course. And you have to say it because otherwise, who knows, this is all recorded. And I just want to say, I've never in my very long life seen consolidation solving a supply problem. I think the one thing we have to acknowledge, there's a shortage of copper. You can't consolidate yourself into additional copper supply or lithium or manganese or anything. So clearly there's the investor perspective and the return on capital perspective. And then if a copper mine gets run by somebody else, it doesn't supply additional copper.
But I think it's a really important point. I mean, often you see that sort of debate, right, which sort of, and again, it plays out in sort of financial markets as if wealth is created by sort of rearranging paper claims on the same set of physical assets. I mean, that's not the creation of wealth. The creation of wealth is the creation of productive capacity, right? It's the creation of more copper mines, more iron ore mines, more nickel mines, and so on and so forth. It really is a second-order effect as to how, right, we redistribute the sort of claims on that. So to your point on consolidation, right, it's exactly that. It's not going to help by just sort of simply packaging if that in the end doesn't precipitate investment, supply, and and all that attends on it.
And with that minority view of a miner, a dinosaur miner who actually believes value gets created through mining, we will call this panel to order and go for whatever we go for at this time of the day. More tea.
More tea.
So it's tea time, coffee time. Henk, despite that horrible Dutch accent of yours, fantastic panel as always. Thank you very much, sir.